Somewhere inside the United States government, there is a category of human being that most people don't know exists. Not a citizen. Not quite a deportee, either. Not in the way that word usually works. A person the courts have ordered removed from the country whose own government refuses to take them back. No home to be sent to. No passport that opens a door anywhere. A legal dead end, sitting in a detention system that has to do something with them, because it cannot simply do nothing. In the summer of 2026, the United States found an answer to that problem, and the answer was Jamaica. Not Jamaicans coming home. That would be routine. A citizen returning to the country listed on their own paperwork. This is different. This is people who have never set foot on that island, who have no family in Kingston, no history in Montego Bay, no connection to Jamaica whatsoever, being placed there anyway, because their own countries said no, and Jamaica, after enough pressure, said yes. This is a story about leverage, about what happens when a small island economy sits across the table from the largest economy on Earth, and that larger economy has already shown, publicly and recently, exactly what it does to countries that refuse. By the time this is over, you're going to see precisely how that leverage was built. Not through a single decision, but through a sequence. A hurricane, a tariff, a warning shot fired at a neighboring country, and finally, a memorandum signed in a room nobody outside of it has been allowed to see. Understand something about how power actually moves between countries of wildly different size. It rarely announces itself as coercion. Nobody stands at a podium and says, "We are forcing you to do this." Instead, it arrives dressed as cooperation, as partnership, as a mutually beneficial arrangement between two sovereign governments, negotiated in good faith. That language is almost always available, no matter how lopsided the actual positions at the table happen to be, because the country with less leverage still has to sign its name to something, and no government wants to publicly admit it signed under duress. So the paperwork reads like a handshake. The timeline tells a different story. And once you understand that distinction, the paperwork versus the timeline, you start to see this pattern everywhere, not just in Jamaica. Small economies, dependent on one dominant trading partner, absorbing a shock they didn't cause, then being asked to accept a policy commitment they had no hand in designing. Jamaica isn't the first place this has happened. It's simply the clearest, most recent, and most fully documented example currently sitting in public view. What makes Jamaica's case worth walking through in full, rather than as a passing headline, is how completely documented the timeline actually is. Most stories like this stay buried in the fine print of trade bulletins and ministry press releases, never assembled into a single narrative anyone outside a handful of specialists ever sees. This one, unusually, has every piece sitting in public record. The storm, the tariff, the precedent, the memorandum, even the one case where the machinery visibly broke down and sent an innocent man to the wrong continent. Which means, for once, you don't have to take anyone's word for how this kind of pressure works in theory. You can watch it happen, in order, with dates attached. Let's start with what was actually confirmed, because the specific language matters more than it might seem to at first. On June 17, 2026, Jamaica's National Security Minister, Horace Chang, confirmed to reporters that his ministry had entered into a memorandum of understanding with the United States Department of Homeland Security. The mechanics, as he laid them out, up to 25 people every 2 weeks transferred from U.S. custody onto Jamaican soil, not Jamaican citizens. Third country nationals, a term for people the United States has legally ordered removed, whose home countries will not accept their return. Chang was almost insistent about the wording. They are not deportees, he told reporters. They are third country nationals. Sit with that distinction for a moment, because it's carrying more weight than a simple correction of terms. A deportee by definition is going somewhere, back to a country that claims them. A third country national is, by definition, not. The label itself is an admission. It's the United States government acknowledging, in its own paperwork, that it has people it wants gone, and nowhere left within its own diplomatic reach to send them. Jamaica became the answer to that gap, a landing point for a category of person the international system doesn't quite know how to file. Now here's where the story turns uncomfortable, because the timing of all this is not incidental. Once you line up the dates, you won't be able to unsee the shape they make. 7 months before that memorandum was confirmed, Jamaica was hit by the single worst natural disaster in its recorded history. On October 28, 2025, Hurricane Melissa made landfall on the western side of the island as a full Category 5 storm. Sustained winds near 185 miles an hour, strong enough to peel roofing off concrete structures, snap power infrastructure at the base, and turn ordinary debris into something lethal at 100 yards. Melissa was the strongest hurricane to strike Jamaica since record-keeping began in 1851. Not the strongest in a decade, not the strongest in living memory, the strongest in 175 years of recorded weather history on that island. Prime Minister Andrew Holness declared the country a disaster area that same day, while the storm was still moving through the western parishes. By the following morning, 77% of the island had no electricity at all. Black River Hospital, a facility an entire region depended on for emergency and trauma care, was destroyed outright. 92 patients had to be evacuated in the middle of the disaster, pulled from a building that could no longer function. More than 450 schools were damaged across the country, close to 2/3 of every school Jamaica has. Regional damage estimates ran past $12 billion, which made Melissa, without competition, the costliest disaster in the country's history. 45 people on the island lost their lives. 6 months after landfall in the spring of 2026, Jamaica was still in the U.S. State Department's own words, in varying stages of recovery, specifically in Black River and Montego Bay, two of the areas hit hardest. Hospitals still short on capacity, classrooms still being rebuilt, an economy still tallying what the storm had actually cost, months after the winds had stopped. That is the exact window the United States chose to approach Jamaica with a deportation arrangement, not before the hurricane. Not years into recovery, once the country had some financial breathing room again. In the specific stretch of time when Jamaica was at its most economically exposed, still absorbing the cost of the most expensive disaster in its history, still rebuilding the basic infrastructure a country needs to function. If you were searching for the exact moment a small economy has the least room left to negotiate from a position of strength, this was it. And these arrangements rarely get made when a country is standing on solid ground. They get made in the gap, when a nation is stretched thin enough that resistance suddenly has a price it isn't sure it can afford to pay. Consider what a hurricane like Melissa actually does to a government's negotiating position, beyond the visible damage. Reconstruction on that scale doesn't get paid for out of loose change in a national budget. It requires borrowing, international aid, insurance settlements that take months to process, and a tourism sector, one of the country's primary sources of foreign currency, sitting damaged and half-empty during what should have been peak booking season. Every one of those pressures pulls in the same direction, toward needing your largest trading partner to stay friendly, to keep market access open, to not add a punitive tariff on top of a hurricane bill that hasn't been paid off yet. A government in that position isn't sitting down at the negotiating table as an equal, it's sitting down as a debtor, whether the word debtor ever appears in any official transcript or not. And Jamaica didn't have to guess what that price might look like. It had already watched another country pay it, in real time, a year earlier. In January of 2025, the United States offered Colombia a similar arrangement. Accept deportation flights without conditions, without limits. Colombian President Gustavo Petro refused. He turned away 2 U.S. military aircraft carrying deportees, citing concerns about how the migrants aboard were being treated. For roughly 24 hours, it looked like a sovereign government had drawn a line and intended to hold it. Then came the response, and it came fast. 25% tariffs, announced almost immediately, on every category of Colombian export entering the American market. Coffee, cut flowers, crude oil, all of it. That 25% was set to double to 50% within a week, if Colombia didn't reverse its position. Alongside the tariffs came personal visa sanctions on Colombian government officials and their own families. Not abstract economic pressure aimed at an economy in the abstract, but pressure aimed directly at the individuals making the decision and at the people closest to them. Colombia reversed course within 24 hours. The White House's own public statement afterward described exactly what Colombia had agreed to. The unrestricted acceptance of all illegal aliens from Colombia returned from the United States, including on U.S. military aircraft without limitation or delay. Read that phrasing again slowly. Unrestricted, without limitation, without delay. That's not language you'd use to describe a negotiated middle ground. That's the language of complete capitulation, extracted from a sovereign government in under a single day, using economic pressure alone as the instrument. Every other government in the region was watching that exchange unfold, whether they wanted to be or not. And the lesson available to all of them was identical. Refusal has a price. It will be applied immediately, it will be applied publicly, and it will be applied to you personally. not just to your country's economy in some distant abstract sense. There's something worth naming about how fast that entire episode moved. 24 hours from refusal to reversal. Not weeks of quiet diplomatic backchanneling. Not a gradual escalation designed to give both sides room to save face. A public rejection, followed by an immediate and enormous economic threat, followed by a complete reversal before the next news cycle had even finished. That speed is itself a message. It's a message that travels well beyond the two countries directly involved. It tells every other government watching exactly how little time they'd have to weigh their own options if they ever found themselves in the same position. 24 hours doesn't leave time for parliamentary debate. It doesn't leave time for a careful cost-benefit analysis conducted by economists. It leaves time for exactly one calculation. Can my economy survive what's about to happen if I say no? And for most governments in the region, the honest answer to that question is no, it cannot. Jamaica was watching too, and 2 months after Colombia's surrender, I got a preview of what a version of that same pressure could look like, applied to its own economy. On April 2, 2025, the Trump administration rolled out a wave of reciprocal tariffs across the region. Jamaica was assessed at 10% on everything it exports into the American market. Neighboring Guyana was hit with 38% on its oil, rum, and gold. These weren't abstract figures sitting in a policy memo somewhere. These were real costs, landing directly on export industries in economies that depend heavily on access to American consumers to function at all. Jamaica had just watched Colombia get crushed economically for saying no. Jamaica had just felt its own tariff assessment land 2 months later, a smaller number than Colombia's punitive rate, but a number nonetheless, arriving from the same administration in the same policy window. Somewhere inside that sequence, the calculus in Kingston shifted. This wasn't a country freely choosing a partnership it believed in on its own merits. This was a small, hurricane-damaged economy, heavily dependent on its largest trading partner, negotiating from underneath the weight of a very recent, very public demonstration of what defiance costs, and a hurricane bill it hadn't finished paying. So let's actually look at what Jamaica agreed to, because even by Minister Chang's own public account, the details are strikingly thin for an arrangement carrying this much weight. 25 people every 2 weeks, not detained, according to Chang's description, though where, specifically, these individuals would be housed remained undecided at the time the arrangement was announced to the public. Compensation to Jamaica for its participation is still under negotiation and has not been disclosed. There's a stated safety mechanism. Transfers pause automatically if more than 10 people are present on the island at any given time. And underneath all of it sits the core clause that defines the entire arrangement. If the United States determines that a person cannot remain in the country, and that person's own home nation refuses to accept them, Jamaica becomes the default destination. Read that mechanism again, because it is, functionally, the whole story compressed into a single sentence. Jamaica isn't only accepting its own citizens who get deported home. Jamaica has agreed to become a landing point for whoever else the American immigration system produces and cannot place anywhere else. A backstop for a policy failure that has nothing to do with Jamaica's own migration situation, its own laws or its own borders. A country of roughly 3 million people, a country that was still repairing hospital wards 7 months earlier, has taken on a formal role inside someone else's enforcement gap. Think about what that actually means for the people who get transferred under this arrangement, not just for Jamaica as a government. A third country national doesn't arrive with a path forward already built into the paperwork. There's no established route to legal residency in the receiving country simply because you were sent there. There's no guarantee of work authorization, no guarantee of family reunification, no clear timeline for anything. In many arrangements structured like this one, a person can end up in a kind of permanent holding pattern, physically present in a country, but without the legal status that would let them build an actual life in it. Not undocumented in the way that term usually gets used, and not a refugee with recognized status either. Something in between, indefinitely, unless a future government decides to resolve it. That's the human reality sitting underneath the bureaucratic language of structured managed process. It's not just a logistics question of where 25 people land every 2 weeks. It's a question of what kind of life is legally available to them once they do. And this exact scenario had already gone wrong once, in public, in a way that should have made everyone involved more cautious rather than less. This is the part of the story you need to hear in full, because it's the clearest evidence available of how this system treats the people caught inside it. In 2025, a Jamaican man named Orville Atoria received a deportation order. His order specified Jamaica by name. That's not an ambiguous detail, that's a legal document naming an exact destination. Instead, Atoria was placed on a flight alongside 4 men of entirely different nationalities and sent not to Jamaica but to Eswatini, a landlocked country in southern Africa he had absolutely no connection to. No family there, no history there, no legal basis for being sent there whatsoever. Just a seat on a plane, headed somewhere his own paperwork never named, apparently because it was administratively convenient in the moment, not because it followed any document on file. A Senate Foreign Relations Committee minority report, released in February of 2026, put an exact figure on what that single flight cost. More than $181,000 per person aboard. Sit with that number for a second. Not just as a line item of wasted public money, but as a measure of how little friction there was in the system that produced this outcome. Over $180,000 spent per person to send a man to the wrong continent entirely, in direct contradiction of the document that was supposed to govern exactly where he'd go. It took weeks. It took international scrutiny. Journalists asking questions, advocacy organizations pushing back, and eventually enough diplomatic pressure to force a reversal before Eswatini released him. Orville Atoria was then flown more than 7,000 miles back to Jamaica, the exact country his original deportation order had specified all along. 7,000 miles in the wrong direction and 7,000 miles back, to correct a mistake that a single piece of paper had already prevented. If anyone inside the system had simply read it before boarding him onto that plane, that's not a footnote buried in a report. That is the clearest, most concrete evidence available of how casually this entire apparatus treats the individual human beings moving through it. And it's a case Jamaica had already lived through, publicly, before formally agreeing to accept third-country nationals from other countries entirely. If a Jamaican citizen, holding a document that explicitly named Jamaica as his destination, could still end up shipped to the wrong continent by administrative error, what confidence should anyone reasonably have in how third-country nationals, people with no home country willing to claim them at all, no document naming anywhere specific, will actually be handled once they land? And consider the asymmetry embedded in that story. It took a Senate committee, a minority report, international press coverage, and diplomatic intervention from multiple governments to correct one mistake involving one man with a document that should have made the error impossible in the first place. That's the level of external pressure required to fix a single case that got noticed. The 25 people every 2 weeks arrangement Jamaica has now agreed to involves people with no equivalent paperwork trail, no home government pushing on their behalf, no built-in advocate anywhere in the process. If it took that much visible pressure to bring one man home from the wrong continent, it's worth asking, soberly, what happens to the cases that never generate that kind of attention at all? Nobody currently has an answer to that question, and that absence of an answer is itself part of the story. Before we go further, I want to put something to you directly, because this is exactly the kind of story where I think the people watching have sharper instincts than most news coverage gives credit for. If you were running a small country, dependent on a much larger one for trade, and that larger country had just shown you, clearly, publicly, within the last year, exactly what refusal costs, would you have signed this deal, or would you have taken the tariffs instead, and accepted whatever came with that decision? I genuinely don't think it's as obvious a choice as it looks from the outside. Sitting comfortably wherever you're watching this from, put your honest answer in the comments. I read every one of them, and on a story with this many moving parts, the way you all see it actually shapes how I approach the follow-up. And if you're the kind of viewer who wants the full picture before the headlines catch up to it, the context, the numbers, the parts that get quietly left out of a 90-second segment, that's exactly the reason this channel exists. We're closing in on 20,000 subscribers right now, and every person who joins is what makes it possible to keep digging into stories like this one, instead of settling for whatever surface-level version gets the most clicks the fastest. If you've made it this far into the video, you already care more about the details than most people bother to. So if you haven't yet, consider hitting subscribe before we keep going. It costs you nothing, and it's genuinely what keeps this kind of reporting reaching people who want the whole story, not just the headline. All right, back to Jamaica. Because while the government in Kingston was out publicly defending this arrangement, a significant number of Jamaicans were not staying quiet about it. In early July, more than 500 protesters gathered in Kingston specifically to oppose the deal. A substantial turnout for a policy most people in the country still hadn't been shown in writing. Opposition leader Mark Golding put his objection into a public statement. "We cannot allow Jamaica to be turned into a foreign deportation holding pen through a legally toxic policy." Sit with that phrase for a second, holding pen. That's not the language of a diplomatic partnership between equals. That's the language of a country being used as storage space for a problem that originated somewhere else entirely, one it had no hand in creating and very little say in resolving. The opposition's demand has stayed consistent and specific throughout. Table the complete agreement in Parliament. Let elected officials, and by extension, the public they represent, actually read the terms their own government committed them to. As of the most recent reporting available, neither the Jamaican government nor the United States has released that document. Not to Parliament, not to the press, not to the public, whose country is at the center of it. The citizens of Jamaica, whose island this arrangement directly affects, have been asked to trust the terms of a deal they are not currently permitted to see. There's a reasonable question buried in that standoff, and it's worth asking plainly. Why would a government withhold a document it's already confirmed exists, if the terms genuinely were as limited and controlled as Minister Chang has described them publicly? A structured process with a hard cap of 25 people, a built-in pause mechanism and clearly defined terms is not, on its face, the kind of document that typically needs to stay hidden from an elected legislature. Governments generally withhold agreements for one of a small number of reasons: ongoing negotiation over sensitive terms like compensation, concern about domestic political backlash once the specifics are visible in full, or language somewhere in the text that reads differently on paper than it sounds out loud from a podium. Chang hasn't said which of those reasons applies here. Nobody has. And in the absence of an answer, the public is left to fill in that gap with whatever explanation feels most plausible to them, which is rarely the most generous one available. And if the situation weren't murky enough already, a second, entirely separate proposal got tangled into public understanding of what was actually happening, muddying a story that was already difficult enough to follow. Jamaica's former ambassador to the United States, Audrey Marks, had floated a different concept entirely: a skilled migration program that could eventually bring in up to 10,000 third-country nationals under a completely different framework than the 25 people every 2 weeks transit arrangement Minister Chang described. But once that figure, 10,000, entered the public conversation, it merged, in a lot of people's minds, with the actual signed memorandum. Suddenly, the public wasn't only reacting to 25 people every 2 weeks. Some of them were reacting to a number 10 times larger, tied to a separate proposal that hadn't even been formally adopted as policy. Prime Minister Holness has spent weeks since trying to publicly untangle the two, telling Jamaicans, in effect, that the thing sparking the most alarm and the thing that was actually signed are not the same document at all. Whether that clarification is actually landing with the public is a different question, because once fear and confusion take hold of a story like this, careful corrections rarely travel as far or as fast as the original alarm did. There's a pattern worth naming in how that confusion took shape, because it isn't unique to Jamaica. It's close to a universal feature of how contested policy stories spread. The frightening number reaches people first, attached to a headline, stripped of the nuance about which framework it actually belongs to. The correction arrives later, buried in a follow-up statement from a prime minister, trying to sound calm rather than defensive, competing for attention against a number that's already lodged itself in the public imagination. By the time officials get around to explaining that 10,000 refers to a proposal, not a signed commitment, plenty of people have already made up their minds based on the bigger, scarier figure. That's not necessarily anyone's fault in particular. It's simply what happens when two different documents, drafted by two different people for two different purposes, land in public conversation close enough together in time that most people never get the chance to tell them apart. And here's where this entire story takes its strangest turn, because at the exact moment Jamaica is managing an unreleased deportation agreement, an ongoing hurricane recovery, and a tariff hit to its exports, the United States quietly handed the country a symbolic upgrade in a completely different arena altogether. On January 17, 2026, the U.S. travel advisory for Jamaica was downgraded to Level 2, the same risk classification given to France, the United Kingdom, and Italy. For a country whose economy leans heavily on tourism, that is not a minor bureaucratic footnote buried in a State Department bulletin. Travel advisories function as a kind of public trust signal, and tourism officials treat every level change as a meaningful shift in how outsiders are being told to perceive the destination's safety. Sandals Resorts, one of the largest hospitality operators on the island, responded publicly with visible enthusiasm, describing the downgrade as bringing clarity, confidence, and an undeniable sense of excitement. That's a marketing department doing precisely what marketing departments exist to do, converting a bureaucratic classification shift into a reason for tourists, sitting on the fence to finally book the trip. But here's the detail that got lost underneath that excitement. The underlying risk language inside the advisory itself did not change at all. It still cites a homicide rate that the Jamaican government's own published data describes as among the highest in the entire Western Hemisphere. It still references sexual assaults that the U.S. Embassy says it hears about routinely from tourists staying at resorts, not occasional, isolated reports, but a pattern consistent enough that embassy staff use the word routinely to describe it. The actual measurable risk profile of the country did not improve between one advisory level and the next. The number went down. The reasons that number existed in the first place stayed exactly where they were, untouched in the same paragraph, just underneath a smaller headline. That's an important thing to understand about how travel advisories actually work, because most travelers assume the level number is a direct, honest summary of the risk data underneath it. It isn't always. The level is a judgment call, made by people inside a government bureaucracy, weighing multiple factors that don't all point in the same direction. Safety statistics, yes, but also diplomatic relationships, trade considerations, and the broader tenor of the relationship between the two governments at that moment. Two countries with identical crime statistics can carry different advisory levels depending on how warm or strained the relationship between their governments happens to be at the time the advisory gets reviewed. That doesn't mean the level is meaningless. It means the level is never purely a safety measurement, no matter how often it gets treated that way by resorts eager to sell rooms, or by travelers scanning a headline before booking a flight. For Jamaica's tourism industry, that downgrade landed at a moment when it needed good news more than almost any other point in recent memory. An industry still working through storm damage, still short on staff and inventory in some of the hardest-hit parishes, suddenly had a fresh, positive headline to hand to prospective visitors. Level 2, same category as France. It's easy to see why Sandals leaned into that message as hard as it did. What's harder to see, unless you go looking for it directly, is that the sentence sitting just above the good headline never actually changed. So you have to ask the obvious question: why would a downgrade like that happen now, in this specific window, layered on top of a tariff relationship and a deportation memorandum that both required Jamaica's continued cooperation to function? A friendlier travel classification doesn't cost the United States anything measurable. It doesn't require congressional approval. It doesn't appear as a line item in any budget document. But it functions quietly and effectively as a form of goodwill, a low-cost signal of diplomatic warmth extended toward a government that had just agreed to something politically difficult and materially expensive at home. Whether that connection was ever stated outright in any actual negotiation is not something either government has confirmed on the record. But the timing sits there regardless, available to anyone willing to lay the calendar out and look at it directly, whether it turns out to be coincidence or something closer to strategy. Step back now and look at everything sitting on Jamaica's desk at the same moment, because this is the part that tends to get lost entirely when each of these stories runs separately, on its own, disconnected from everything around it. In the summer of 2026, Jamaica is a country still repairing hospitals and schools damaged by the worst storm in its recorded history. It's simultaneously promoting a travel advisory downgrade to a tourism sector that, by the U.S. State Department's own description, still hasn't fully recovered from that same storm. It's operating under a 10% tariff on everything it sells into its largest trading partner's market, and it's managing a deportation agreement it has not been able to fully explain to its own parliament, because the terms still haven't been made public. 6 months after the arrangement was first confirmed to reporters standing in front of microphones. None of those four realities happened in isolation from one another. They landed on the same government in the same calendar year, stacked on top of each other in a way that leaves remarkably little room to maneuver. A country still rebuilding from a historic disaster has less leverage sitting down at a trade negotiation. Less leverage at the trade table means less room to refuse politically difficult requests when they arrive. Less room to refuse means agreeing to arrangements your own opposition is publicly calling a holding pen without being able to show your own elected parliament the actual document you signed. It's worth pausing on just how unusual it is for four separate pressure points to converge on one government in a single calendar year like this. A hurricane is a natural disaster. Nobody engineered Melissa, and no government controls when a Category 5 storm makes landfall. But a tariff schedule is a choice. A travel advisory level is a choice. The timing of when to formally announce a deportation memorandum versus when to quietly finalize it months earlier and only confirm it publicly once questions started circulating, that's a choice too. Only one of the four pressures bearing down on Jamaica this year was outside anyone's control. The other three were decisions made by people on a calendar, in a sequence that consistently worked in one direction. That distinction matters because it's the difference between a country simply having bad luck and a country having bad luck that then got used as an opening. None of this requires believing in some hidden master plan drawn up years in advance. Governments rarely operate with that kind of foresight, and the more mundane explanation is usually the more accurate one. An administration recognized an opportunity when it saw one, and moved when the moving was easiest. That's not a conspiracy. That's just how leverage actually gets used in real time by people paying close attention to which of their negotiating partners currently have the least room to say no. And the three people standing closest to this story cannot agree on what it even is. Minister Chang calls the arrangement a structured, managed process, controlled numbers, a built-in pause mechanism, carefully chosen terminology designed to keep the language precise. Prime Minister Holness said publicly that the alarm surrounding it is almost ridiculous, framing the reaction as disproportionate to what was actually agreed to on paper. Opposition leader Golding says Jamaica is being turned into a holding pen for a policy failure that was never its own to solve in the first place. A structured process, an overblown panic, a holding pen. Three completely different descriptions of the exact same document, and not one of the three men agrees with the other two. There is a single document that would settle definitively which of them is telling the truth. It has Jamaica's Ministry of National Security named on one side, and the United States Department of Homeland Security named on the other. It has been referenced by name in public. Its existence has been confirmed on the record. Its terms have been described only in careful fragments, filtered through a government minister speaking to reporters. And as of everything currently known to the public, nobody, not the ministry that signed it, not the parliament that is supposed to provide oversight of it, not the opposition demanding to finally read it, has released that document. Notice, too, that all three men have every incentive to describe this the way they're describing it, regardless of what the document actually says. Chang is the minister who negotiated it. Of course, he calls it structured and managed, because the alternative is admitting he negotiated something reckless. Holness is the prime minister whose government will absorb the political cost of public alarm. Of course, he calls the reaction overblown, because validating it means validating criticism of his own administration. Golding is the opposition leader positioning himself for the next election. Of course, he calls it a holding pen, because outrage is the currency opposition politics runs on. None of that makes any of them necessarily wrong. But it does mean that nobody with direct knowledge of the document's actual contents has an incentive to describe it neutrally, which is exactly why the document itself, not another paraphrase of it, is the only thing that would actually resolve the disagreement. So here's what I keep coming back to, turning this story over. A country doesn't get pulled into an arrangement like this because it wants to. It gets pulled in because refusal became more expensive than acceptance. Expensive in tariffs, expensive in political capital, expensive in a way that a nation still rebuilding from a Category 5 hurricane genuinely couldn't absorb on top of everything else already stacked against it. That's not a conspiracy theory whispered in the margins of a comment section. That's a plain, verifiable timeline. A hurricane in October, tariffs landing in April, Colombia's surrender in January, a full year earlier, setting the precedent everyone in the region quietly took note of, and Jamaica's memorandum, confirmed in June, arriving at almost exactly the moment the country had the least capacity left in reserve to say no. Whether you think that sequence amounts to coincidence or deliberate strategy is, honestly, part of what I'd like to hear from you directly, because arrangements like this rarely announce themselves as pressure campaigns while they're actually happening. They get described afterward as partnerships, as cooperation, as a structured, managed process between two willing governments. It's usually only in hindsight, once someone takes the trouble to lay the dates down next to each other in order, that the actual shape of it becomes visible. And it's worth remembering that Jamaica is not a minor player being singled out for no reason. This is one of the most recognizable countries in the Caribbean, a nation with global cultural influence far beyond what its size on a map would suggest, a long-standing and generally friendly relationship with the United States, and an economy that, hurricane aside, was functioning normally. If a country with that much going for it, visibility, goodwill, a functioning relationship with Washington, still ended up here, still ended up signing an agreement it can't show its own parliament, still ended up absorbing tariffs while rebuilding from a historic storm, then the more uncomfortable question isn't really about Jamaica specifically at all. It's about every other small economy in the region watching this unfold, quietly running the same calculation in private that Jamaica ran, and drawing the same conclusion. If Jamaica said yes under this much pressure, what exactly makes any of its neighbors think they'd have more room to say no? If this is the kind of story you want more of from this channel, the kind that connects the dates nobody else bothers connecting, that sits with the uncomfortable timeline instead of rushing past it, subscribing genuinely helps make more of this possible. We're building toward 20,000 subscribers, and everyone watching this all the way to the end is exactly who this channel is made for. So if you haven't yet, now's a good moment to join us. And before you go, I want to leave you with the question this story never actually answers. Not who's right between Chang, Holness, and Golding. Reasonable people can disagree about that, and probably will for a long time. Not even what's specifically written inside that memorandum, though I suspect we'll eventually find out. The real question sitting underneath all of it is this. When one country's economy is small enough and its neighbor's economy is large enough, does the word agreement even mean what we've always assumed it means? Or is it simply the polite, diplomatic word we use to describe a decision that was never really optional in the first place, dressed up afterward in language that makes it sound like a choice? Think about how often that word gets used in exactly this way across all kinds of relationships, not just between countries. An agreement implies two parties who could have walked away from the table and chosen not to. But when one side controls access to the market the other side's entire economy depends on, when one side can impose a tariff with a phone call and the other side would need years to find a replacement trading partner even if it wanted to, how much of that walk-away option genuinely exists in practice? Jamaica signed a memorandum, that much is fact. Whether Jamaica ever really had the freedom to sign anything else is the part that doesn't fit neatly into a press release, and it's the part I don't think anyone outside of a closed-door meeting in Kingston can answer with total confidence. What we do know is this: the storm was real. The tariffs were real. The precedent set with Colombia was real, and it happened in full public view with a timestamp attached to every part of it. and the document that would tell us exactly how those three things connect to the fourth. The memorandum itself remains the one piece of this entire story that nobody in a position to release it has chosen to. Tell me what you think in the comments. I mean that sincerely, not as a throwaway line at the end of a video. This is exactly the kind of story where the audience usually notices an angle I hadn't considered myself, and I'd genuinely like to read it. If you found this useful, it helps more than you'd probably guess to hit subscribe on your way out. We're not far from 20,000, and stories like this one are exactly what that milestone is going to fund more of. Thank you for watching this all the way through. I'll see you in the next one.